Welcome to Public Comment. I'm John Dunbar, former mayor of Yountville.
And I'm Alfredo Pedroza, former Napa County supervisor.
We're going to talk about politics, people, and whatever else is on our mind.
I don't know why they want to fight all the time.
Find anything to do with wildlife and wildlands and sue.
And they're coming in here saying, we're going to protect you from yourself.
And then guess who pays for that? Okay, Alfredo, what are we talking about today?
Well, John, I think we got to talk about special interest groups. I think it's a subject that we hear a lot about in the community, and I think today it's prime for that. Full disclosure, I just came from a lunch, so I'm on a full belly and I've had some great wine. So I'm probably in a great mood, just to be very honest today.
Hey, we have said we've committed to being candid and uncensored. So
where do we start?
Feel free.
But where do we start? Because there's so many groups, right? There's the professional groups, like the Center for Biological Diversity, one of my favorites. But then there's like Vision 2050, some of the Climate Now groups. But also, how do you entertain some of the older groups like Get a Grip on Growth, which I think were different from than what we're seeing today?
I think there are two very different categories. One is local residents and local organizations that care about Napa County and what goes on in Napa Valley.
Yeah.
And then there are the professional activist organizations. And I would put Center for Biological Diversity right at the top of that list. Water Audit California, they are
one of your favorites.
Well, they're both a real challenge because they are outsiders coming in and using their mission to dictate what happens here in Napa County. And I don't think that's appropriate.
Well, my struggle with them is, they come in with this attitude like, we're going to protect you, Napa residents, from these outsiders, when in fact, they are the freaking outsiders, right? And when you look into their missions, to me, they're not vested in Napa. They're not here. They don't have their kids in schools. They're not shopping at local grocery stores. They're not seeing the pressure points of local business owners or our homeless population. They come in and leave, but then they celebrate when they defeat these projects. I don't think that's genuine. And quite honestly, I think it's bullshit. And we got to call it out.
I agree. And I will give credit to some of the local folks who have they have strong opinions. And I respect that. We agree on some things, we disagree on others. They have strategically called upon, in one example, Water Audit California to do their bidding. So you have a professional attorney that comes in and represents all things related to water concerns.
He's your buddy, right? Your best friend.
My challenge to them has been, and none of it's personal. They claim that I was personally attacking their people. That's not true. What I am doing is calling out their tactics. Yeah. At the 11th hour of every application that they disagree with, they do a big data dump, knowing that whether it's the County Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors has to stop and review all of that, and then county staff has to respond to it.
But look, I think when we say that, that's insider talk, right? So I think we got to break it down to the resident. Like, what does a document dump mean? And I think we got to possibly explain that, right? Because what happens is you have a project, an applicant that submits an application to the county or to the city, to the town, years in advance. They work with the county to respond to comments from the county or the city, the government agency. So they're responding to concerns about wildlife, habitat, setbacks, erosion, whatever it may be, impacts. And then the applicant responds to that, all in the public record, right? So then that takes months, a lot of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions of dollars, to respond to comments. And those comments are legitimate, right? These are professional county staff, right? They're not politicians. They're professional staff that are exercising their judgment based off their profession and education. And the applicant responds. And then you have these special interest groups that are monitoring it. And the problem is, to your point, so what happens in a document dump, when the county makes a position, we document it, we notify people, the neighbors around it. And then right before, we're about to have the public meeting or the public hearing, they come in with all these pages of new information. Now, how is that working in good faith? It's not. And that's what we mean by document dump, of being very intentional, of trying to be disruptive, not being transparent. And what really, I think, pisses people off is these are the same organizations that are saying we want transparency in government. Yet they're not operating by the same principles and values, right?
I also don't think that they're doing justice to represent the true interest of the residents. There are a few folks that are more extreme, and they use this strategy to their benefit because they know that it's going to stop the process or severely slow it down, which is what they want. And what's lost in that are the legitimate concerns. There can be legitimate claims that need to be vetted, like you said, that happen through the public process. But when you intentionally wait until the last minute, just before a planning commission hearing or a supervisor appeal, and it creates a whole different dynamic, it is intentional to be a burden, not only on the applicant, but on the whole process.
Well, and I think let's kind of peel the curtain off, right? In terms of, I can give you some experiences of when I was chair of the board. We would have meetings, right? We would have the applicant and the appellant, which could be one of these wonderful groups. We'd come in and we'd say, we'd agree to these processes, right? You have to submit information by X date. You have to submit your witnesses by X date. As a chair, you would make a ruling on that of what was allowable, what's not. They were both there looking you in the face saying, we agree to this, right? And then you fast forward, you exchange emails, everyone agrees to that. And then the day of the hearing at 8:30, when a meeting's supposed to start at 9, the appellant in some of these groups, this is a fact, right? Center for Biological Diversity did this multiple times. They'd come in with hundreds of pages of new information. Yet, a couple of weeks ago, they had agreed that they were already submitting all the new information. And when you push them on it, it's like, well, there's new information. Well, what about the years of review? And that's what we have to expose. That's not someone saying, I care about you. It's someone trying to protect their special interests and, quite honestly, maybe monetize their mission at the expense of others. And
Well,
that's true.
Absolutely. And where the funding is coming from is also a question. It's very suspicious who is funding all this time for lawyers that are supposedly representing the interests of Napa County residents. How is it they bring what I called in public comment their boilerplate arguments? Because not every project in Napa County has endangered species and habitat restoration concerns. Some of them might. Some have stream setback concerns and clean water issues. They get mitigated. And then, as you say, there can be temporary settlements made. And then when it comes before the body for final decision, planning commission or supervisors, then all of a sudden something's thrown in. And it's not fair to the applicant. It's not fair to the public because I think it's misleading and it's not in good faith. And again, most of the public doesn't pay attention to those things. Most of our residents don't apply for things with the cities or the county. So they don't understand the dynamics that are at play.
Yeah.
Center for Biological Diversity is an international activist organization.
They're a professional.
I've printed out some information about them because
I read them all.
They are often the appellant, and then there are locals that sign on with them. They're based in Tucson, Arizona. They have 186 staff members listed on their website. Over 50 of them are attorneys. The one person that is typically the representative for the organization, Frances Tinney, is an associate attorney from New York, went to Stanford Law School, and she's in the division. It's the Urban Wildlands Program division of the organization. That means she and the other folks in that division, their main goal is to find anything to do with wildlife and wildlands and sue or threaten to sue. And they even say on their website, they're a national nonprofit with more than 1.7 million members and online activists dedicated to the protection of endangered species in wild places. Where is that in the Napa County rules and regulations that you have to go up against that kind of an organization in order to get an application through the system?
Well, look, I think we got to question who's funding them. And let's just be completely transparent. There are local people that are funding Water Audit California. We know that. right? And it's local vintners that are using this veil, right, to fund that. And I think you got to call it out. If you have these values, own it and say it and represent it, right? But to use a professional apparatus that, to your point, as you've illustrated, they're not from here and they're coming in here saying that we're going to protect you from yourself, that's bullshit. And we got to call it out because at a certain point, it's not fair. And if you have someone that's wanting to invest in Napa that is trying to do some good, they should be held to a very high standard. Because if you're going to do business in Napa, the bar is freaking high and it should be high. But when you have these groups that are appealing these projects, it's actually diminishing the credibility of what they're trying to protect. Because I want to make sure we have good water. And if a vineyard's going to impact water quality, we should know, right? If we're going to, farm or develop on a wetland, that's problematic. But when they throw all this stuff, in the sink to try to create chaos, that's actually a disservice to the very causes they're trying to do.
Absolutely. And again, some of the research I did with biological diversity, part of my frustration is the fact that they're absolutely not local. Uh, the closest office they have is Oakland.
Yeah.
But that you're not required to have local representation. I get that. But
Agreed.
I will at least credit Vision 2050 and Napa Climate Now as people that live here that care about our community. These folks are hired attorneys to come in and make claims that they know will take hours and hours and lots of money for the staff to follow up on. And then guess who pays for that? The applicant.
Yeah.
So that's why you have years and millions of dollars that is not the aberration. It's more normal than it should be for applicants to come forward.
Yeah.
And then after all that, the applicant has said, well, you need to negotiate down your request in order to get support from the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors. And maybe you should donate some of your land to the land trust, or maybe you should only ask for a percentage of what you want, because otherwise we're going to have these professional, activist organizations represent and cause you even more pain.
You're poking the bear by mentioning that. But look, you mentioned care, and I just want to push back on that because you and I, when we were in office, we had to meet with people that liked us, that didn't like us, but we did it. And some of these local organizations, and I do want to draw a distinction between the ones that we have now to the ones we had then. Some of these organizations are not taking the time to understand and listen to each other. They've made up their mind on people and business already. And I say that based off facts and experiences because I dealt with many of these folks that we mentioned that are part of these organizations. They're not wanting to fight and compromise. And I don't know why. I don't know why they want to fight all the time versus sit down and look at how do you move the ball forward? How do you actually create a vision for Napa Valley? And when you look at some of these people moved to Napa recently too, but they're not doing what we did to try to find compromise. So when you say care, I have a hard time accepting that because when I look at some of the business people that are investing real money into the community, they're willing to listen. They understand that you don't get carte blanche to development, that there's mitigations if there's an issue, and you have to be a responsible, land steward. I've seen that. It's rare that you and I can point to an example where we approved a project that created significant issues in our community, right? And there's checks and balances on that. But some of these groups aren't really playing with the same set of rules that everyone's playing with. And I think you got to expose that and call it out because they're the ones that are creating this false narrative.
It's also not fair to applicants that are doing what they're asked in terms of county regulations. Not everybody that comes before the county or the cities for projects have a lot of money. They don't know how to operate the system. So they do what they're told in order to get an application through. It could be a small business in the city of Napa. It could be a vineyard project. It could be a winery development project. And they're following the rules. And if they knew ahead of time, it would cost this much time and roughly this much money, they could decide whether they were going to make that commitment or not. Problem is they go through all that with that budget of time and money, and then they get sabotaged in some cases by these professional organizations. And it's not fair to the local folks that do want to do the right thing in protecting our environment and our habitats and wildfire protection, because it's disingenuous.
Well, it goes back to like what I said earlier, right? Drawing a distinction between those that we have now to those that we had, previously. And I look at like a get a grip on growth organization. That was a slow growth organization. And Jenny Sims is part of it. And I didn't agree with her on everything, but her interests were genuine. There was a vision. There were some values behind that. Again, didn't agree with them, but she stood for something and she fought for something. And she knew that there was a way to make things better by sitting down and compromising with people. And I would put more people into that category. Some of these other groups, they don't have those values, right? You have these professional staff that are monitoring the county application portal to look at which projects they can appeal. And sometimes the bigger the name, the more excited they get because they can monetize that. That's a fact. And that's what I have a struggle with of we've monetized advocacy versus saying, look, this project has some legitimate concerns. It's in our domestic watershed. It goes into a drinking source. Like those are all real. And we should look at monitoring wells or buffer setbacks from municipal reservoirs. But we're not even having that intellectual conversation because we're fronting it with all this noise that these, professional advocacy groups are doing. And to me, that's a disservice to this community.
I agree. And I'm also not saying that I'm against some of the rational and open-minded positions of habitat and environmental protection. We both,
Yeah.
with less credit given than I think we deserved, we were both committed to that as much as anybody else in the county or the cities or the town.
Well, to that point, right? I would really take these groups seriously if they got involved, on committees, on general plan updates, on the climate committee we created. Where were they? Right? If you really believe in these values, not just from a monetization, so you can have the balance sheet to pay you. How many attorneys do they have? The 50 that you mentioned, so they can pay that. Get involved. Why is it that they're only getting involved when they're fighting a project, which means they can get paid to do that?
Well, and you alluded to it just a moment ago. There's an absolute value for professional organizations to want to be in Napa County. It is a high profile place. And if they get successes here, they get to show that off and have, I would say, feathers in their cap, but I'm sure they don't want to use feathers. So I would say some kind of recognition of their successes, because they see this as just a monetization of their activism. It's not about whether a vineyard should be planted on a hillside with a certain slope, even if it's, zoned for ag, or if a winery wants a modification, or somebody wants to remodel a home in the county property. I mean, they are finding excuses to submit appeals. That's different, I think, than when we see some of the stronger environmental advocates that live here that have genuine interest in protecting Napa County. We don't always align completely, but I at least have some respect for them speaking mostly the truth, not always, maybe stretching it a bit, but they're not hired experts to come in and disrupt.
Well, the example I would use, look, where I live, it's an HOA. And when we first moved in, my wife and I were trying to get the different cable service, and they're all, well, if you put any structure to your home, you need approval from the HOA board. I'm like, well, who's on the HOA? So I kind of knew who I would have to work with. And it was clear. But imagine if you didn't know who you had to work with. It changes everything, right? And I just use that as an example of how simple it can be when you're trying to do something, whether it's your home or your business or your project, and you don't know who you're trying to work with. And when you have professional organization, you don't know who is on the other side of the table. So it's hard to sit down and have a basic human conversation because that group on that side, they're not wanting to make it better. They have a goal, which is to fight and win. In my opinion, go leverage that so they can raise more funding to keep fighting the next project.
You mentioned and make a very good point about why does it matter to the average person that lives here? And in one example, it matters because A lot of people lost their homes in the wildfires in 2017 and 2020, for example, much of it in the unincorporated area. These groups would say you can't rebuild there. So you've had that property in your family for generations, maybe. And now you're being told because there's a special interest group saying that they don't want it, that you can't rebuild your lost home. Is that fair?
The problem with fairness is just like you can relate it to wanting to rebuild, and it's very relatable, especially with what's going on in the state of California, Southern California, right? But to me, it's just like I try to be a simple person. And if you disagree with me, I want to be able to sit down and talk to you. And I want to know that you're being honest and when we're sitting down. And we're dealing with groups of people that I don't think care about this community. And I'm going to be direct, right? Because if they did, their body of work would be different. Their body of work would be when the county was doing a strategic plan, they would show up and they didn't, right? They're showing up when they're fighting projects, and the bigger the name, the more they show up. And when they win, they celebrate it and they send newsletters about fundraising based off that. That's not genuine, right? And I think for a local resident, I hope you know what people are fighting against, that it's professional groups trying to shape a community where they're not vested in. And if you're here, and some of these people, to your point, Vision 2050 does have some people that are here, but when you look at their board members, some of them don't even live here anymore. And if they chose to live somewhere else, how much do they care about this place? And that's an honest question, right? But if you're here, then get involved and actually challenge yourself to put your values on the table so we can debate them. And let's have an intellectual conversation versus a political conversation. Then they send out these newsletters to try to monetize momentum and create funding around this cause. That's disingenuous.
Well, the irony, and I think you mentioned it at the very beginning of our conversation, is um, a call for transparency with government officials.
Yeah.
And here we have an example of a lack of transparency with what I'm calling activists who are just trying to fulfill their own individual missions. So, as is everything that we talk about, more to come, I think, about these issues. And it isn't just about wineries and vineyards and county lands. This is impacting our whole community.
I would take it one step further. When someone wrote you and I a check when we were in office, we have to disclose that. Some of these groups, whoever's writing those checks, and you know who you are if you tune in, have the guts to say you're doing it because you believe in it, right? And it goes back to when we talk about the Ag Preserve. There was people that said we have a different vision for Napa, and they were open and honest about it in terms of some wanting more protection, some was saying it was a taking. We're not doing that anymore. So whether you're part of Save Napa Valley Foundation and you're writing a check to Water Out of California, have the guts to write that check directly so we know who you are. And that's okay. Again, doesn't mean that we cast judgment on them. It just means those are your values, and that's okay. But then let's talk about them openly in a way that we're mature to say we disagree or agree. But let's actually make the output, which is the vision for Napa County, better versus playing chess, right, with a couple hands behind our back.
Yeah, that I'm glad you mentioned the issue. We have 2 new supervisors, and I hope they recognize in their new roles. I mean, Supervisor Alessio served with the Napa City Council, but Supervisor Manfrey has never worked in government before. And I can't remember if I ever saw her in the chambers during supervisor meetings. So I hope they understand that agents of these organizations, it doesn't have to be the lead attorney for CBD or the lead attorney for water audit that has funded or not funded their campaigns. It can be agents, meaning people that are directly connected and support the organization, could mean they have conflicts. I hope county training for the new and even the reelected supervisor to make sure that they all understand there may be either explicit or perceived conflicts of interest because of the people that are supporting them. It was always something that we had to pay attention to. Every elected official has to pay attention to it. And so we don't get to pick and choose when that matters.
I could do my own podcast on that, but
when we might.
But here's what I'll tell you. Like, I wish them well. They got elected by the people in Napa to lead. So lead, but own it. and question and understand and take the inputs and ask the tough questions. I really believe you have to ask the tough questions, right? Because it's an incredible opportunity, but there's a lot of interference and influence, right? By organizations that are not transparent, right? Just to be clear. And I hope that they listen and they have the courage to say, this is what I stand for, and show up, not hiding behind a foundation, not hiding behind an organization. So that way we could actually make the outcome better. Because I do believe that's the path forward, right? In our industry groups, and I'll say ours because I'm a vintner and a grower, the principals don't hide behind the staff. They say, I am a vintner, and this is my name. And they approach it from the podium without a veil of curtain because they're proud and they're confident in what they are and confident in their position. The opposition needs to do the same.
And I have faith, as you just stated, in our new planning commission, new board of supervisors, and our new leadership in all the cities. But what I ask for is strong leadership and the transparency that's been called for in years past. Let's just make sure that we can toast successfully to transparency and strong leadership.
And I think we should wish them good luck too. I really mean
absolutely.
To the future. John, I'm glad we had the conversation, man. It's something that in the 10 years I was on the board of supervisors, we've been dealing with these special interest groups, and they've been a giant pain in the ass. And I say that not from a place of hate, honestly. I say that because every time they were at the board, they were fighting projects. And they were hired guns, which is a line you like to use. And it wasn't about making Napa better. It was about stopping growth and funding their operations. And I think today we call them out for what it is, and it feels good.
Well, we had to distinguish between those extremists and people that live here that just have a different perspective on what is important to them than maybe you or I have. And that's reasonable. I get that. And that's where we need to have those conversations going forward, because we live here. These folks don't even live here.
Well, as you said earlier, they're not even local folks. They're national organizations. And there's a space for people that disagree with how you and I view the world, and that's healthy. But what's not okay is being a for-profit organization that's here to monetize division so they go pay their attorneys to go fight other projects and other people. That is not okay. And I think mission accomplished because we called them out today.
Yeah, they're activists for hire, and they're not going to be here to deal with the consequences of what they're doing. And so we have to just have those honest conversations every day.
Which I think we did.
We did.
Cheers, my friend.
Cheers.